All right, welcome everyone. Um, my pleasure to speak to everyone this afternoon or evening, depending on where in the world you are. My name is David Weeks, and I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of Sunrise International, and I'm joined by Chloe Liu, who is the CEO of our China office. In today's webinar, we will be presenting the top-level findings from Sunrise's most recently published white paper called "Trends in Chinese International Education in 2025: The Latest Recruitment Market Intel." So during our webinar, we will use a structure that follows the same structure that our white paper did. So first, we'll talk about some study destinations and visa trends that we're seeing for Chinese outbound mobility. The top level finding being that more Chinese students are studying overseas now than ever, although the country destinations that those students are choosing are increasingly diverse. Second, we'll talk about the topography of policy uncertainty, both in the US as well as in some other big four Anglophone study destinations. We'll then talk about the economic backdrop of recruiting in China, namely talking about China's sort of slow economic recovery in recent years from its pandemic era slump in the Chinese economy in 2022. And then discussing what does a more value conscious or more cost conscious, a more ROI conscious Chinese family mean for recruitment strategy. From there, I'll turn the floor over to my colleague Chloe, who will present the latest data on international schools in China. Those are useful predictors of the long-term appetite for study overseas from China. We'll then talk about China's drive to restore its inbound study abroad and what the impacts are for overseas recruiters. There are some interesting pickup opportunities for universities that are interested in creating new inter-university partnerships in China. So we'll unpack that a little bit. Next, we'll talk about the agent landscape in China, identifying some new openings of study abroad agencies in China, as well as the accelerating fragmentation of the agent landscape in China. At around the 50-minute mark, we'll pivot to Q&A. So if you have any questions at all throughout the course of the webinar, we'd ask that you use the Q&A tool built into Zoom so that we can answer the questions in the order that they are received. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started now. Just as a bit of housekeeping, I'd ask that all the questions, if you could just send those into the Q&A tool in Zoom, that would be really helpful, rather than using the chat tool in Zoom. That way we can see all of the questions in sequence. If you have to jump off at any point during the webinar, or if you if you have colleagues who'd like to share the recording of the webinar, then that will be an option for you. We will send the recording as well as the PDF version of the slides to everyone who is registered, and you can feel free to share those with any colleagues who are interested in seeing the recording. So as a bit of context, every year Sunrise publishes this year-end white paper where we summarize the key trends that we saw in the recruitment landscape, particularly for overseas universities that recruit Chinese students. So our annual webinar or our annual white paper summarizes what we saw in the past year and then aims to make predictions for what we expect in the coming year. Much of this is based on data that we gather inside of China. Sunrise is a full-service media production studio and advertising agency in China. So we work with about 250 universities from around the Big Four, as well as from major destination countries that recruit Chinese students. When we work with universities, we tend to collaborate with them on localizing their digital presence inside of China, things like creating Chinese websites, operating Chinese social media accounts, as well as running digital ad campaigns. One of the other sort of avenues by which we learn about the recruitment avenue or the recruitment landscape in China is by running recruitment tours of China. Every year, Sunrise runs 4 recruitment tours, 2 focused on undergraduate and 2 focused on graduate recruitment in China. So that sort of on-the-ground texture and context is often very helpful for us as we learn about what's happened in the last year in China. So to begin, let's talk about top-line study overseas numbers from China, and in particular, where Chinese students are choosing to go. So first, we can look at the big 4 study destinations for Chinese students. So across the US, UK, Australia, and Canada, as well as New Zealand, we see that there are 702,000 Chinese students enrolled in universities in the big 4 Anglophone study destinations. That is an increase of 1.6% compared to the past reporting year. Not all of these destinations have fared the same. We've seen sort of slow but incremental growth from Canada and the UK, some rapid growth in the most recent reporting year from Australia, and a slight decline in numbers from the US. So we'll unpack what's happening in each of these markets individually. Overall, though, if we pan out from just beyond just the big four, if we include the top 15 destinations, or excuse me, the top 14 destinations for Chinese students globally, China is sending about 1.1 million students to study overseas. The big four destinations account for about 64% of that total, although we are seeing an increase in the number of students who are choosing to study inside of Asia in the special regions and territories near China, as well as China's near abroad. So cumulatively, those Asian study destinations made up about 24% of the total last year. So first, let's talk about the US. So Chinese students attending US universities, compared to last year, we did see about a 4% decline in the total number of Chinese students. That faces the fall semester of 2023. Facing this next fall semester, we do see some cautious sort of avenues for optimism. In particular, the Common App is reporting that applications from China are up 6% as of January, which suggests that more Chinese students at the undergraduate level are applying earlier to colleges and universities in the US. We're also seeing that visa issuance in the US is evolving. So facing the fall semester of 2024, year-on-year visa issuance was down about 8% compared to the big increase that we saw in 2023, but it's still up about 41% compared to the pandemic low point of 2022. So overall, as we assess Chinese outbound mobility to the United States, I think that we have kind of this period of soul searching among U.S. universities. It's true that China is, its pace of growth has slowed down in sending students to the U.S. But it's also true that that China represents the largest sending market for undergraduate students to the U.S. by quite a wide margin. China currently represents about 25% of all undergraduate students coming to the United States. And it's actually, in terms of undergraduate numbers, it's bigger than the next four countries combined. The total number of undergraduates coming from China is 2.4 times that of India. And I think that that's driven in large part by the strong baseload of Chinese students that choose to study in the U.S. Each year. I think that unlike other markets like India or sub-Saharan Africa, Chinese families do spend a disproportionate amount of their income on education. And I think there's this awareness that the Chinese middle class and upper middle class, the ranks of those sort of affluent and internationally mobile students are just very high in China, and that it would take really substantial compounded year-on-year growth from these other emerging markets to match the sort of muster that we see from China in terms of undergraduate enrollments. Meanwhile, China is still a significant player in graduate recruitment, making China as of last year, it was the second largest sending territory for graduate students, and it is the largest sending territory for non-degree seeking students as well. Meanwhile, in the UK, we have seen that the UK is unique among the sort of big four Anglophone study destinations. In the UK, we saw that in the last reporting year, enrollments from China increased by 1.5% last year. And the UK is unique among these big four study destinations in that it's the only study destination that has actually increased its Chinese enrollment since the pandemic. Overall, the UK is up about 8% from China compared to before the pandemic. Now, these numbers are thrown off a little bit because the UK does report its numbers of international students by country. It does report those later in the year. So we're not going to see sort of what the 2023 to 2024 academic year looks like until June of this year. But so far, we are seeing that UK universities are trending in a positive direction. In terms of the makeup of that enrollment to UK universities, we're seeing a sort of a convergence of graduate and undergraduate. So previously, the UK had, was consistently overperforming in terms of graduate recruitment, and its undergraduate population from China was smaller. But here we're seeing that the undergraduate numbers from the UK are increasing, while that pace of growth is slowing down for graduate. So we're seeing that the UK is becoming a more balanced market, recruiting both graduate and undergraduate students. Recent data from UCAS also supports this idea. UCAS data is generally capturing undergraduate students, and that shows that as of January 2025, that there was an 8.9% increase in the number of applications from China. Now, one of the big movers in terms of the sort of the big four study destinations for Chinese students, one of the big movers was Australia. Australia gained about 10% in terms of its Chinese enrollment in the calendar year of 2024. And you can see that Australia actually does a pretty nice job of reporting out the different subsectors of particular varieties of enrollments that are coming from China. So you see that that the growth in Australia has largely been driven by a growth in higher education, which is the blue bar here, as well as ELICOS, which is the English language training programs administered by Australian providers, which is the green bar here. I think that for Australian providers, the big question is whether or not this increase that we saw in 2024 is a one-off effect, as Australia is now well into the process of imposing a cap on the overall enrollment of international students, and Australia's international population is disproportionately Chinese. China represents a higher share of China represents a higher share of Australia's international students as compared to many other destination countries. Meanwhile, in Canada, Canada had about 102,000 Chinese students enrolled in its universities from 2023 to 2024, which is up about 2.6% compared to last year. In terms of visa issuance, there were 48,000 new study permits issued to Chinese students in the first 3 quarters of 2024. So that's slightly down year on year, and largely is probably attributable to visa caps that have been imposed on different Canadian provinces. So Canada shows that we have a marginal increase in enrollments, but that increase in enrollments is probably not going to be sustained given the decrease in the number of available spots for international students more generally. Now, one of the big talking points that we're hearing about at Sunrise is this big question of whether or not the dominance of the big four Anglophone study destinations is sustainable, or whether or not Chinese students facing economic uncertainty and facing policy uncertainty, whether or not Chinese students are choosing to study abroad, but in other places, particularly within Asia. So I think that there's, the data here shows that, you have 300,000 students now from among the top 15 study destinations for Chinese students. About 300,000 Chinese students are choosing to study overseas in Asia. So that's about 26% of the total number of Chinese outbound students. So there's an interesting question here about whether or not Asian study destinations poses a long-term threat to the Big Four. I think that one thing that I'd point out here is that one of the big leaders here are Japan and South Korea, which cumulatively make up just under 200,000 of those students. I think that it would be useful to extract out, though, what percentage of these students are studying English language programs versus programs that are administered in a language other than English. So if you have a student who's interested in learning the Japanese language, I'm not sure that that student would have ever really considered studying in the US or Canada or the UK or something like that. So I think we can productively extract out some of the numbers of students that are studying in non-Anglophone study destinations. So when we do that, we end up with a clearer picture of what's going on here, where we can assume that about half of the enrollments going to Japan and South Korea are courses taught in English. That's probably a generous assumption. The number is probably lower than that. But if we look at the number of study destinations in Asia that are likely taught in English, we end up with an estimate that's more like 18% of China's total study overseas volume, or about 233,000 students. So I think that in assessing this question of are Asian study destinations a long-term threat to the Anglophone Big Four? Our argument would be no. We have seen significant and rapid growth of about 10% year on year in many of these East Asian and Southeast Asian study destinations. However, where we're seeing the fastest growth is in Southeast Asia, places like Thailand, the Philippines, and Singapore. But I think it's important to remember that Chinese students don't necessarily view a lot of those study destinations, perhaps with the exception of Singapore, as prestige destinations. And it's probably true that Chinese students wouldn't really consider universities outside of the top 5 ranked universities in Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. When Chinese students return to China to apply for jobs, as many of them do, their employers will naturally ask them why they chose a non-traditional study destination. And I think those questions just get a lot harder to answer for students if they chose a non-elite university in a non-traditional country. So I'd say that the capacity of Southeast Asia to undermine enrollments to the US, the UK, Australia, et cetera, is quite diminished because we're not talking about, unlike Big Four destinations where you've got thousands or hundreds of universities that all are recruiting Chinese students. I think it's much more likely that the universities that can plausibly recruit Chinese students from Southeast Asia are much smaller in number, and that naturally creates a much lower ceiling in terms of how of what number these countries can reach. So I'd say that the takeaway here is that we are seeing a growth in the amount of students who are considering non-Big Four or non-traditional study destinations inside of Asia. That growth will probably continue in the medium term at around 10% a year, but we're not. I think that eventually that growth rate will begin to slow down as these countries begin to reach capacity limits that do not exist in some of the other major Anglophone study destinations. As we consider Chinese outbound enrollment, I think it's also useful to bear in mind the push factors that motivate Chinese students to study overseas. I think many of these push factors very much remain in play today. So there are limited access to top-tier domestic universities in China because the Gaokao exam is the thing that governs entry into these universities. And there is a really huge drop-off in educational quality between the top 9 Chinese universities, the tier 1 universities that are generally in Project 985 or Project 211, and then universities that are considered tier 2 universities in China. China also has a uniquely and especially competitive job market for recent college graduates. So that does create an incentive for Chinese students to seek things that help them to stand out in a competitive job market. Overseas job experience and foreign degrees, particularly master's degrees, are things that can really help in standing out in the job process, the job application process. Then finally, I think that there is, a lifestyle benefit to studying overseas, as well as an economic benefit of having access to higher wages, and generally this sort of prestige factor of having international job exposure that's prioritized not just among Chinese employers, but sort of among Chinese families for sort of a prestige factor. Next, we do see policy uncertainty being a much bigger topic of conversation this year compared to last year. So of the Big Four study destinations, we are seeing policy uncertainty in 3 of them. In particular, we have the US election. While we think that the impact of the US election and the Trump administration is generally overstated, there is certainly some uncertainty that is coming out of the Trump administration. Meanwhile, though, that uncertainty is not unique to the United States. We also have visa caps that have been imposed by Canada and Australia that, if fully implemented, would cut the number of student visas issued in each of those countries by 30 to 35%. So the net effect here is that Canada and Australia are probably tampering down the number of Chinese students they're trying to recruit. This does favorably position the UK, although the UK is now, we're starting to see conversations about over-reliance on China and questions about quality control among the students that are being recruited there, which is common among growth markets in China. And it remains to be seen if the US will be able to sort of divert some of those students who might have gone to Australia and Canada. Kind of depends a little bit on the environment for recruiting students to the US based on what we see from the Trump administration. So let's talk about Trump. So first, I think that there has been this generalized sense that the Trump administration is posing many uncertainties for universities. Be that regarding funding, DEI programs, a variety of other things. And there's this sense that, I think that many of our partners in the US feel a bit bewildered with this flood the zone approach that we've seen since the inauguration, where we've just seen so many policies coming from Trump that it's kind of hard to keep track of. I think it's important, though, to remember that there are very few tangible adverse policies from the Trump administration that have targeted international students, or at least that have targeted Chinese students specifically. There is some hand-wringing right now in the US about a possible update to the 2017 era Muslim ban, which banned entry to the United States of students of certain nationalities. There's some discussion that maybe Pakistan and Afghanistan will be included on that list this year. But I don't think that there's any serious observers who think that that the Trump administration is going to impose an entry ban for Chinese students. So I think at this point, we can see that the impacts of current policy are limited and are largely affect Chinese students only tangentially or incidentally. I think that the big thing that we're likely to see is that Chinese students probably will face increased scrutiny for their visa applications and somewhat slower processing times for their visa applications, resulting from budget cuts to the Department of State. We are seeing some discussion about freedom of speech on campus and how that affects people's ability to express themselves about matters such as the Gaza issue, although the number of Chinese students that are affected directly by that, I think, are quite limited. We also have some second-order impacts. For instance, if Department of Education budget cuts begin to affect financial aid allocations, although a lot of that is institution-specific. Lastly, I think that there has been this sort of perception that there is a worst case scenario that the Trump administration may eliminate or cut back the H-1B or OPT programs. However, I think there's cause for cautious optimism on this level, given the influence of the billionaire class, especially those such as Elon Musk in the White House. Musk and his portfolio companies, as well as many other sort of tech billionaires that seem to have a lot of sort of influence over White House policy right now, do really like to hire H-1B and OPT students. It's tax advantaged, and there are other reasons why it's easier to recruit and retain students or workers who are on these visa programs. So our impression is that for 2025, that these programs are not that these programs do not face significant threat. We may see changes to to tax policy on how the incomes that these students earn may be taxed. But what we're not seeing is a clear sign that the Trump administration poses a significant danger to long-term recruitment of Chinese students. I think that there has been this sort of slow accretion of anxiety among Chinese families. So I think that in the coming year, if we didn't see any policy specifically targeting Chinese students, then that would help to restore Chinese parents' confidence in the U.S. as a study destination. I think it's important to remember that we have been here before. So during the Trump administration recruitment cycles, during the first Trump administration, we did actually see Chinese students begin to increase, up until before the pandemic. And when we saw a significant decline in Chinese enrollments was during the pandemic, not so much directly because of any particular policies of the Trump administration. Trump's diplomacy, I think, is unique in that it is very transactional. There is always this sort of attention to who's getting a better deal, right? And I think it's important to call out some of the work that NAFSA has done in mapping out the economic impact of international students coming to the US. Overall, international students contributed about $40 billion to the US economy. And you can see that about half of that was in Republican or swing states in terms of economic contributions as well as jobs created. But like I said, this policy uncertainty is not unique to the US. In Australia, there has been this proposal to cap new international students at 270,000, which would reduce enrollments by 26%. That legislation has been shelved in the Australian Senate, but there are these ministerial directives, number 107 and 111, I believe, that have effectively created backdoors for the Australian federal government to impose visa caps. So each year we're seeing a sustained level of uncertainty for Australian recruiters in that the sort of proportioning of visa caps seems to vary by institution. And there's also sort of this question of the rule of 80%, where visas are being fast-tracked if the student is in the first 80% of of each institution's visa cap. And it seems like visas may be more slowly processed or not issued if they're in the last 20%. So there's a bit of uncertainty from Australia at the moment. Similarly, we are seeing uncertainty from Canada as well. So Canada has been imposing this sort of temporary cap on international student visas with the stated goal of approving 364,000 study permits in 2024. That would be a 35% reduction from 2023 levels. And we're seeing this new announcement for 2025 to 2027 of Canada planning to issue 305,000 new study permits, which would be a pretty significant reduction. The Canadian visa limits are apportioned by province. So some of the provinces that recruit the most Chinese students, particularly Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec, are probably going to be the most directly affected, whereas universities outside of those provinces or states may be less affected. But already in 2024, we saw that international enrollments have dropped by about 50% in Ontario. Now, the net effect on China is a little less clear because Canada has by far the largest sending country of international students to Canada is India. So it's likely that this is going to affect and create basically some displaced students coming from India for future cycles. But China is still the second biggest in terms of overall enrollments in Canada. So we'd expect that there will be some knock-on impacts and maybe some opportunities for other territories and countries to be able to pick up some of those students who aren't able to go to Canada. Now, number three, so that's all to say with policy, that policy uncertainty abounds. I'd say that there are risks that we should continue to monitor if you're in the US. But if you are feeling like policy uncertainty is something that you're struggling with in recruitment this year, my sort of the thing that I would ask everyone to bear in mind is that you're not alone and that we are all kind of confronting different sort of flavors and varieties of policy uncertainty. Now, the next point I want to talk about is China's economy. So in 2022, China had a pretty significant set of economic setbacks. The zero COVID policy, those draconian sort of lockdowns that we saw in China, feel like a distant memory. But as far as the Chinese economy is concerned, the economy is still sort of recovering from this massive slump that it saw in GDP growth and a lot of the supply chain shocks that affected Chinese industry. So that we've seen this sort of slow period and pace of economic recovery in China in recent years. It reminds me a lot of what we saw in the US in the early 2010s, where we saw this very slow and staggered recovery from the 2008 financial crisis. So we're seeing a slow recovery rather than a fast one from China. So as it stands right now, China's economy is growing at about 5% in terms of nominal GDP growth. We are seeing stimulus measures both for monetary and fiscal policy in China. But I think this begs the question of what happens in a world where we're continuing to see slow economic growth from China. Well, I'd say that first, when we see slow economic growth from China, it probably is going to result in very affluent families actually wanting to study abroad at higher rates because they might be interested in sort of, in generally in expatriating the entire family. But I think that for the rank and file of Chinese families, it is driving a greater focus on value and return on investment for the middle class, particularly for families in tier three and tier 4 cities. It's been our observation that when universities talk about affordability and value, oftentimes they limit that discussion to the existence of financial aid and to affordability. In talking about return on investment, they talk a lot about the investment part. So our university isn't as expensive as you might think, or there's financial aid, or or something like that. But I think that there's an underallocation of attention to the return part of this. So talking about higher potential salaries you can earn through OPT or H-1B or whatever sort of post-graduation work opportunities exist in your country. So I think that our main sort of call to action here would be to be aware that in tier 3 and tier 4 cities especially, you will get more questions about affordability and value, and that one way to stand out here is to take ROI, this idea of return on investment, holistically, not just thinking about the cost, but also about the benefits of studying overseas and how families can functionally make their money back in the long term. So in terms of the macroeconomy, an economic recovery would be useful. The lack of a trade war with the U.S. would be useful. It would lift all boats. And some of the key indicators that we'll be looking for in 2025 would be first, overall GDP growth. Is China meeting its sort of analyst expectations for whether or not the economy will grow? Also, the unemployment rate is important. But two often underlooked factors, I'd say, would be first, residential property values. The main reason for that is that many Chinese families choose to fund study overseas and big tuition bills by selling property that they own. So if property values are low, then this means that people will be able to afford less, and it just makes sense. It makes less sense to sell at a low price. But also, it's useful to think about the Chinese yuan's exchange rate with your country's, the exchange rate between the Chinese yuan and your country's currency. The Chinese RMB is kind of at a low point right now, although there is reason to think that the US dollar may depreciate. But if you're asking students to pay in Canadian dollars or British pounds or Australian dollars, it may be that the exchange rate is something that might swing the cost of attendance by as much as 10%. So in terms of the property sector, property makes up about 30% of China's GDP, but it is most important because families are funding tuition bills by selling property. So I'd say that it's useful to observe what's happening with China's property market. I'd say that 2 years ago we were sort of in a low point because of large property developers like Evergrande that were sort of facing a liquidity crunch. The property market has sort of been shored up from those low points, but the question remains to be seen as to whether or not property values will sort of bounce back to their 2021 levels. Employment is also an important question here. So China's youth unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds is at a record high of 21%. So when you have this weak domestic job market in China, that it's been our observation that is actually increasing interest in graduate studies. So we're seeing increased levels of participation in OPT by Chinese students. That's up 12% year on year, now representing 22% of China's enrolled students in the US. So as the number of new graduates entering the labor market is rising, now up to 12 million, there are not enough jobs that are being opened each year to keep pace with that level of growth. So in that environment, we're seeing that students are prioritizing growth industries and programs that scaffold around growth industries, such as green tech, AI, finance, and automotive. And we're seeing that new energy sectors are increasing their hiring of overseas returnees by about 70% year on year. So your programs that you offer that scaffold around electric vehicles, battery technology, and all those sorts of things, those are some important areas of growth in the Chinese economy right now. So as people are generally in social media in China, we're seeing a greater sort of attention to this question of what happens when I come back to China to look for a job. And I think that there's also sort of this attention and question about sort of post-graduation job opportunities in the country where students choose to study. So as you formulate sort of your messages for what works in China, I think that employment, both in your home country immediately after graduation, as well as employment in China in a 2 to 3 year horizon, those are quite useful. Overall, in China, about 80% of corporate HR professionals view having international study experiences as positive, as an advantage for candidates. And an analysis of job ads posted by 36 different Chinese universities has found that 64% of job ads have placed requirements or have placed sort of have announced requirements that emphasize having an overseas background. I think that one of the most useful things for Chinese students when they come back to China up to apply for jobs is not just having a foreign credential, but having overseas internship or job experiences. So I think it's become all the more important to synchronize some of your marketing messages efforts with the work that your career services offices are doing in helping Chinese students to find employment after they graduate. So to wrap up the discussion about the economy, we should continue to watch GDP growth rates. We should also continue to observe what's happening with exchange rates, as well as employment and the property market. So with that said, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Chloe, who will tell us a little bit more about international schools in China.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Chloe. I'm the CEO of Sunrise China office. I'm really happy to be here today. So today I will cover three key areas. The first one is international school in China, so the state of international schools, and the China as a global study destination and the impacts for recruiters. And the last one is the changing roles of Chinese agencies in 2025. Okay, so let's start with international schools, which are an important predictor of overseas higher education for Chinese students. As you can see, in 2024, China had 972 international schools with a market size of 68.4 billion RMB, marking a 2% growth from the previous year. Well, considering the pressures from the pandemic and the regulations change what we are faced, this growth is quite remarkable. Also, it seems we are entering a new phase where the number of schools marches more closely with demand. But despite this slow growth, China still has the largest number of international schools in the world. So to break it down, there are three main types of international school in China. So public international department and private international schools, primarily for Chinese students, and expat schools for foreign passport holders. And as you can see from the orange part in the chart, and the private school dominate the landscape and making up 57% of the international schools and 67% of the market by valuation. However, the number of private schools dropped from 567 in 2023 to 555 in 2024, and mostly due to the market consolidation and some regulation pressures. Also, some private schools are probably shifting to a different model, like becoming expat schools. As you can see, like 9 new expat schools are opened in 2024, which face fewer regulations. On the other hand, the number of expat schools and the public international department are grows slightly, which makes sense since restrictions on new approvals have been easy since 2021. So about international school enrollments, as you can see from the distribution in 2024, 496,000 students were enrolled in international schools. And with 70% of these schools have fewer than 500 students. So basically, small-scale schools are dominating the international education sector. And the geography of international school and is changing. As you can see, tier 1 cities like Beijing and Shanghai have been traditionally been helped, and the tier 2 and tier 3 cities are step into the spotlight. For example, the Guangdong province, with a mix of tier 1 and tier 2, 3 cities, account for almost 15% of all international schools. And the Jiangsu province, with only tier 2 and tier 3 cities, now surpasses Shanghai with 30.5% of the market share. So the situation shows that the middle class in tier 2 and tier 3 cities is getting bigger, and people there really have a stronger design to study abroad. So about international tuition, so let's talk numbers. In 2024, the average tuition was 120,000 RMB. As you can see here, expat schools was the most expensive at almost 200,000 RMB. And the public international department charged at 80,000 RMB, making them the most affordable option for parents. Well, tuition rates vary by region. Of course, tier 1 cities tend to have higher fees than tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So in conclusion, China's international school industry is evolving with slight growth and the rising demand in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. Despite regulation challenges, opportunities still remain strong because families continue to look for global education opportunities for their children. Okay, so next part we will talk about China's roles in international education. So as you can see, China has long been a key player in the global education industry. It's not only one of the largest outbound students, but also has been an important destination for international students. So in 2019, China hosted around 500,000 international students. Well, however, border closures and visa restrictions during the pandemic caused a sharp decline. And by 2024, the number of international school students had dropped to 253,000 students. Until recovery has been slow. For example, the number of American students participating in long-term study programs in China fell from 11,000 students to just 469 between 2022 and 2023. Well, here is the good news. For example, since 2023, the Chinese government has been actively boosting international education. Those include a plan to welcome 50,000 young Americans and 10,000 French students to China from 2024 to 2028, and as well as another plan to launch 800 international summer school projects over the next 5 years. So government policy and initiatives, programs like Young Envoy Scholarship, also enhance cultural and academic ties through short-term exchanges and summer schools. In 2024, 14,000 Americans participated in exchange across China. Opportunities for recruiters and the university. So for US and French recruiters, that's a golden opportunity. Chinese universities are actively looking for partnership to promote study in China and foster global connections. Even though some US universities are pulling out due to the political pressures, this creates space for enterprising universities to establish new collaborations. So despite these challenges, China's potential as a study abroad destination still remains strong. So let's dive into another important development in study abroad sector, the growth of agents, which is a key predictor of overseas study abroad industry in China. So in 2024, there was a 11.5% increase in new study abroad agencies, with 3,454 new companies registered. So this growth represents a 82% increase since 2021. It's very impressive. So in 2024, Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities account for almost 50% new agencies. This shows there is a growing demand for study abroad opportunities outside major urban centers, such as Tier 1 cities made up 27%, and the new Tier 1 cities like Hangzhou and Chengdu contribute 24.5%. And Tier 2 cities had the highest growth at 70%. And this means the agents market is getting break up and spring out. So these days, the performance of those established agencies varies widely. For example, New Oriental Study Abroad Division report a 24% revenue increase, reaching $439 billion. However, a BOSA survey found that 80% of agents face tough competitive face tougher competition. And this means agents need to adapt quickly to keep up with a competitive market. So about the fragmentation, which brings both challenges and opportunities. So on one hand, recruiters must invest time in building relationship with like smaller and less experienced agents and educating them on commission-based models. And on the other hand, it opens access to new students pool and allow for like a perfection recruitment strategies. Eventually, a competitive market benefits students and families with better options and lower costs. So the last part is the impact of technology. Technology is reshaping the China agents market recently. For example, the rise of direct admission has become more popular, where universities can like send offers to students directly based on their public profiles. And the Chinese agents usually help students to target rich schools and recommend match and safety schools. But another key trend shaping the agents market is the blurring line between traditional commission-based recruitment channel and tech platforms, such as applications submission tools for students and counselors, like the Common App, as tech platforms partner with universities through a referral phase. So it's uncertain if agents will see this as a threat to their own commission, or they will see it as a new tool to help students with offer from less known universities. So in the long term, this could affect agents who work with less selective universities. Okay, so to stay relevant, agents must stay on the top of these trends and adapt it. Okay, that's everything I will share with you today. So David, if you would like to take it from here.
Much, Chloe. So in terms of, so just to recap some of Chloe's points, I think that we're seeing a slower marginal increase in growth in Chinese international schools this year compared to previous years, but we are still seeing that environment grow. So that shows that there is still sustained interest over a 5 to 6 year long horizon in study overseas from China. Meanwhile, on the partnership side, China's drive to attract more overseas students to study in China is creating new opportunities for partnerships with Chinese universities, both those that face education abroad as well as those that face inbound recruitment. And then finally, like Chloe was saying before, we're seeing more agencies open up. So that is creating some competitive pressures on existing legacy agents that are sort of the incumbent players in the space. So while not every agent is having a great time in China necessarily, some of the biggest are doing quite well, and some of the smallest are doing quite well. So in that environment, we're seeing an accelerating fragmentation of recruitment from agencies. That comes with pros and cons, as Chloe just described. So in wrapping up the overall in assessing the landscape of what Chinese education overseas looks like this year, we'd say first that in terms of destinations, Chinese students are more flexible as far as choosing non-traditional study destinations. If you are recruiting for a big four country destination, you should be aware that there is a little bit more competition from Asia, but that is not an existential threat, but it is something that exists on the margins. And our main call to action would be that it's important to reinvest and preserve investments in China right now, particularly as many universities seem to be over allocating towards emerging markets or to markets in South and Southeast Asia. I think it's important to remember that baseload of undergraduate full paying students coming from China is truly unique, and I would say for at least the next decade, truly irreversible. So as you consider what this means for your recruitment strategy, I would say that there are three things. First, I think that it's important to take an all of the above strategy. If you work with agents, great, continue to do so and be open to new partnerships with some of these startups that have been created. I think that it's useful to continue to recruit students through things like recruitment tours and in-person events in China's newly opened international schools, particularly in those tier 2 and tier 3 cities, and to preserve both an indirect channel of recruitment of students through partnerships and through agents, as well as those B2C or direct recruitment channels, such as recruitment fairs, in-person events, and digital marketing campaigns. So in terms of the next steps, I would say that there are a couple of things. First, if you'd like, I'd encourage everyone to have a look at the white paper. It's about a 40-page document with a lot more data than what we presented here. These were just some of the highlights. If you have a look at the white paper, we'd certainly encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or interested in how some of our findings might translate into updating or revamping your recruitment strategy in China. I'd also encourage you to have a look at our YouTube channel, which where we share recap videos from our most recent tours, as well as our blog, where we share case studies of successful digital campaigns that we've recently run with overseas universities. In being accessible and visible to these students, I think that it's necessary to be present on the Chinese internet, which includes having local Chinese websites, as well as doing local Chinese SEO and being present on the social media platforms that people use in China, like WeChat, Weibo, and Bilibili. And then finally, we encourage you to consider our recruitment tours as part of your offline recruitment event toolkit in the years to come. Again, we have 4 recruitment tours a year for undergraduate and graduate. So with that said, I wanted to take the last 10 minutes to answer any questions that any of the audience might happen to have. So if you have any questions for us based on any of this data, please feel free to use the Q&A tool built into Zoom, and we'll answer the questions in the order that they come in. Does anyone have any questions? So we'll give everyone a minute to to organize their thoughts and send us any questions through the Q&A tool, and we'll look forward to answering them as they come in. So the first question that we got is from Danny. Danny asks, what are the cities that you include in your recruitment tours? So yeah, Danny, we generally focus on tier 2 and tier 3 cities, particularly for undergraduate recruitment. And generally a recruitment tour, the way that we run them is we concentrate and focus the tour on 2 clusters, 2 geographic clusters of nearby cities. So we'll generally visit 6 cities over the course of 11 days. And we'll go to 3 cities that are in one cluster, so say the northeast of China, and then 3 cities in, say, the southwest of China. Generally a focus on tier 2 cities and tier 3 cities for undergraduate recruitment tours. For graduate recruitment tours, we tend to have a bit more of we go a little higher up in the sort of the city tiers, because many Chinese universities, or many tier 1 many tier 1 cities in China have a disproportionate concentration of Chinese universities. So it's easier for us to visit upper tier 2 and tier 1 cities for graduate tours. So all to say, pretty deep China in terms of our focus for undergrad, and a little bit more sort of a mix of tier 1 and tier 2 for graduate recruitment. The next question we have is anonymous, and it is, are potential students placing a tier model on US schools? So I would say that Chinese students are certainly aware of rankings, but I don't think that there is an explicit tiering of US universities in the same way that there is in China, where you have very clearly the C9 League, which is sort of like China's Ivy League, and then you have tier 1 universities, which are generally in Project 211 or Project 985, and then you have tier 2 cities. These are, tier 2 universities. That sort of classification of universities actually comes from the government. It is sort of public, and it is sort of like a widely accepted way of categorizing universities. I'd say that for Chinese students, when they look at the US, there's not that explicit tiering model that's done in the same way. Now, with that said, they are looking at rankings, but I think more so than in previous years, China looks a little bit more like the average Chinese family looks a little bit more like a more value conscious shopper who's taking into account affordability and return on investment, as well as overall ranking. So it might have been true that If a family got one offer from a university that was ranked 49th and tuition was $50,000, and got an offer from a university that was ranked number 50 in the US and tuition was half of that amount, the family would probably gravitate towards choosing the higher ranked school, even if it was much more expensive. I think now that's a little less true. So I think that parents and families are indexing the ranking against the return on investment question. So I think that that's I think that's welcome balance, and I think that you're beginning to see sort of a dual focus on affordability and value, as well as on overall ranking. The next question is, what are suggestions for Canadian universities entering Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities? And particularly and then there was a question about our recruitment tours, and do we act as an event provider, or do we take on recruitment tasks as well? So yeah, a lot to think about there. So for the person who asked this question, Sunrise acts as an event organizer of recruitment tours. So we're not a commission-based agency. We don't sort of pick favorites. There are usually about 25 universities that attend the tour, and we welcome the representative of those universities to sort of do the work of recruitment. Our work is more sort of the operations of the fairs and getting as many students attending as possible. As far as particular dates of our tours and all that, I'd encourage you to reach out to us or just have a look at sieconnection.com. That has a list of all of our cities and dates. So you can see which tours include just Tier 2 cities, which include Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities. But to the broader question of suggestions for Canadian universities in Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities, I'd say that Tier 3 and Tier 4 for right now, given where the Chinese economy is right now, I think that focusing on post-graduation employment outcomes, your ability to, what does the employment landscape look like for your recent graduates in your particular city in Canada, I think that those are particularly powerful and useful. And then I would say that the other thing is to really, gear in and talk about why your university might be more affordable compared to some of your rivals. And I think that, as part of that, you might sort of talk about how the Canadian dollar, the Canadian dollar currently has a lower comparative value compared to the US dollar. Given the drop in the Canadian dollar relative to the RMB, that might actually make your university significantly more affordable for those families. So I'd say that you've got a bit more sort of attention to cost saving in Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities. Ian asks the next question, which is whether or not we can speak to the largest non-Chinese populations that one may find in international schools in China, such as Americans, Koreans, Hong Kong, and Taiwanese. So yeah, if you go to an expat school in China, you're going to meet Chinese families or you're going to meet families who are not PRC citizens. That's going to be people who have passports from a foreign country or territory, as well as people who are in the process of applying for residency in those places. I'd say that in Guangdong province, you do have a good number of Hong Kong or Macanese passport holders. But overall, the largest international student population in China at the high school level is definitely Korean students. There are entire high schools that are mostly Korean students. And generally at a lot of the sort of IB schools in China, the Korean students do make up the largest percentage. The next question is, what can we do to encourage Mexico to be a good option for Chinese students? So I'd say that Mexican universities are in an interesting place because there is quite a bit of cross-border trade happening between Mexico and China right now. A lot of that is actually Chinese companies trying to avoid tariffs that were imposed by Trump 1. So Chinese companies basically exporting products to Mexico, doing some level of value addition, and then re-exporting to the US. So we're seeing a lot more sort of like Sino-Mexican connectivity in terms of, economically speaking. But what we haven't seen is top Mexican universities getting the same numbers of international students from China that you would expect based on the economic data. So I'd say that the story there should probably follow the story of job opportunities in Mexico relating to this rapidly increasing China-Mexico economic trade and connectivity, talking about companies like in China, some of the biggest companies like Didi, which is China's version of Uber, has a massive operation in Mexico. China's bike sharing apps like Mobike, also quite big there. So I'd say that the growth of Chinese tech majors, Chinese technology infrastructure investments, things like Huawei or ZTE, a lot of these major Chinese multinationals have quite significant operations in Mexico. So I'd say as a Mexican university, you can do more to kind of speak to this story of how the China-Mexico economic relationship is growing in importance, and students have the ability to be sort of leaders in that rapidly growing dyad of connection. The next question is, can we share more about current Chinese government policy on academic partnerships between Chinese public universities and universities in North America and Canada? Generally speaking, we are not, there's a growing appetite for partnership between Chinese universities and universities in North America. A lot of that has to do with China's own KPIs as far as attracting foreign students to study in China. But there are opportunities to create partnerships that involve an exchange of students going in both directions. So now, more so than any time in the last 5 years, Chinese universities have been told to increase the number of partnerships that they have. And I think that there's this bureaucratic incentive, right? Where if your KPIs are increasing foreign student enrollments and increasing international partnerships, well, if you're the international office, there's only so many more students you can recruit. There's only so many scholarships you can give. So particularly if a university isn't meeting their student recruitment targets, they can meet the other KPI more effectively by adding many new partners. So I'd say that there's a growing appetite and interest for inter-university partnership in China. But it's not like the good old days of the 2+2s or the 3+1s or the X+Xs. We're seeing less of these. The pattern has generally been that these partnerships have been focused on short-term exchanges, on research exchange, faculty-led exchanges, and sort of lower-hanging fruit. We're seeing there isn't quite the same number of dual degree programs being approved as there used to be. It's also true that the new dual degree programs that are being approved are not so much like a 2+2 structure, but they're a little less equal now. So we're seeing more 4+0s or things that involve sort of a US university or Canadian university providing teaching resources to a Chinese university, but less so in doing an even exchange of 2+2. So that's all to say that the topography of opportunity is different. Schools are more interested now than ever in forming partnerships. Are they going to produce the same amount of revenue and enrollments as a good old-fashioned 2+2 that might have gotten approved 10 years ago? No, but it's a heck of a lot better than no partnerships getting approved at all. So generally, the policy environment is positive, but one that involves terms of exchanges that are probably less equal and less advantageous to the international partner than there used to be in the past. The last question, I know that we're past time here, so we'll take this question as the last one. The last question is, can we speak a little bit more to ROI for Chinese families and where in the recruitment process this should be discussed, particularly given the nuances of tier 2 and tier 3 cities? So yeah, I think that this discussion of the return on investment of tuition dollars spent at your school is, I think, a foundational one. I'd say that if you have a Chinese website or a PDF overview in Chinese of your school, I think that the return on investment horizon, the affordability and sort of the cost benchmarks of studying overseas and how your university fares better than others, the statistics you can share about job placements and about post-graduation salaries in your home country, I'd say that those are foundational. Those should be in the first page view of your website. So if you're giving general statistics about the university, its overall enrollment, its overall ranking, something like that, that's where you should have the employment stuff. It should be on page 1, first page view. It should should very much be front and center. If you're doing local SEO or PR campaigns in China, I'd say having stories that tease out this idea that you can make your money back as an economically rational Chinese family by choosing to study in your university, I'd say that those should be one of the 3 big pitches that you make each year. So I'd say in terms of prominence, it's useful to have it be front and center in your WeChat account, in your social media posting schedule, and on your Chinese website. And in terms of those offline interactions with Chinese families, I think that it should be one of the three main, if you're talking and doing an elevator pitch to a family over the course of 90 seconds, just to start a conversation at your booth, I think that it should be in the top 3 points that you raise about your university. So maybe one might be the location and why it's a good place to be. One might be your ranking relating to specific, the program specific ranking that you're recruiting for or something. But then I'd say something about employability, affordability, and ROI belongs in the top 3 there. We just answered 7 questions. So thanks very much, everyone, for the productive Q&A. I hope this was helpful. So we very much we're looking forward to staying in touch with everyone. If you have any questions, we'd love for this to be the start of a conversation rather than the end of it. Please do feel free to download the white paper and feel free to share the recording with any of your colleagues who are not able to join us today. With that said, thanks very much, Chloe, for your contributions today, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a good rest of your day and take care.